The other day I tweeted that I got a mosquito bite on my pinky. Today I woke up and suddenly I have one under my chin, and it's just like, what is wrong with mosquitoes this year? I've never had this, like, such annoying places. Good morning, good evening, good whatever time it may be to you all. Today we're going to be taking a look at the meta for V-EB06, looking at what happened in Japan and trying to apply it to our local scenes. We've already had a week of the English format of, V-EB06. We just had the trigger twice VGCS conclude, which was in 2-deck format, showing to us that Bermuda is still a very dominant force, but we did see like Brant and stuff in there as well, so the meta is shaping up to be pretty interesting. But today we're going to be, once again, with the help of Dexander's cool data gathering and information, we're going to be taking a look at what the meta looked like in Japan at the time of the V-EB06 meta by the time it finished. So we're going to summarize it up. I think a lot of you can expect what it's going to look like, but it's still worth to take a look at and dissect and really talk about what the standard is looking like right now. I wish I could do this for premium. I don't think it's... I've been pretty vocal about it on Twitter, but I am really into premium right now, and so I think the premium... Solemn already covers it in a sense, but I think like the premium meta is going to be super interesting after next week once the premium collection releases. But let's just take a look at the premium, at the standard meta after V-EB06. So here is our pie chart. I need to like relocate myself. So looking at it now, we see dominantly, still crazy dominantly, 48% of tops are Bermuda. Again, I'll note, as every time, there's a lot of team tournament results in this, but 48% is insane. This is almost 50% of the meta is Bermuda. This is quite problematic. It does go down to some extent with the next release, and it's been going down a bit with each release of a new set, but 48% is not okay. 48% is a lot because like the deck is just really strong. It's super consistent. It can really like end games on turn 3, which is pretty scary. Like it has so much plussing, it has so much like advantage generation, and just like so many like big numbers that they can make. Like Force 1 literally doesn't even matter. This is like before Force 2, but when Force 2 is legal, starting the next set, V-EB07, then it's just like, it's really strong, because at that point, you don't even need the extra power. You take that extra crit from Force 2, and you just like steamroll with it. So Bermuda is insanely strong. Like, it's I think everybody knows it by now. It's an insanely strong deck. It's ridiculously good. The thing what's interesting here is that Kagero did take second place with 26%. I think Kagero, at first people doubted how good the Great was. Like, I remember when the Great was regular, people were like, it's okay, it's not that good. And then suddenly it's like 40 bucks and everybody's like, oh wait, why? But really, the Great is a really great card, pun intended. But I already said in my set breakdown, it's a good card. Having 2 additional attacks is always going to be good, especially in a Force Clan. So being able to push that up with both Neoflame and the Great is always going to be good. Like, it's always going to be great. And so it wasn't very surprising to me that Kagero was so well represented. Keep in mind that obviously the meta isn't just dependent on like how good a deck is, it's also on how popular it is. So if you have a tournament of 128 players where like 80 of them are playing, it's a bit of an over-exaggeration, but if let's say 60 of them are playing Kagero, it's pretty likely one of them at least is going to end up in the top, so usually more than that. So that's part of the reason why for Kagero and for Bermuda the numbers are so big as well, because Bermuda has a lot of representation, because a lot of people think, okay, this is the best standard deck, so I should play it, the competitive people. Then they see Kagero, they're like, okay, maybe I didn't want to play Bermuda, but Kagero is just about as good, a little bit less good, but still very good, so they take that too. And Kagero is a very popular clan as well, so that obviously adds to all of that on top. So I think it's definitely not something to be underestimated in that sense. So I think it makes sense why these 2 clans are like, they literally take up not even 2/3, it's 3/4 basically of the whole meta. So if you go into a tournament, like if you play 4 rounds, you're likely to have 3 of your 4 rounds, looking at this at least, like 3 of your 4 rounds are probably going to be Bermuda or Kagero. So that's something. So it's definitely like decks to prepare for, decks to keep in mind, decks to like keep checked in terms of how to play against. And like the worst thing with Bermuda is like it's really easy to play, and it's hard to play against. Like, not a lot of decks can really play against it. It's like going first, maybe you can do a bit more, but then they kind of, even like going first, like they still have, even going second, like Lieselot is still a really good card, because if they like call down the Lieselot on like grade 1, it's still extra attacks, It's still doing so much more. So I think it's a really strong deck, and Kagero as well. Kagero is really good. I think it's gonna get even more tools soon, and we're gonna have like a branching kind of build status for Standard at least, so we'll have Blade Master decks and the End and the Great decks. Actually, there's 3 different decks, because the End is considered its own thing too, because when you build for the End, you kind of have to really build for the End, just because it's like, you know, the requirements for it to go off is like low cards in hand, etc. So a lot of people play like 12 crit and stuff like that, and just like don't run draws at all. And so a lot of people build it differently. They don't play it together with the Great. The Great is kind of its own thing. And so that's why also the yen has been dropping in price in Japan, just because the Great is actually better. So that's pretty interesting, I think. It's interesting to see how the meta is going to shape up with the next set. I'm quite excited to cover that. But for the time being, like, this is the state of, you know, the meta for now. But looking at the smaller percentages, you know, nowhere near as big as our big 2, like, mammoths over here. But OTT, I mean, thing is, when you have a force meta, protect decks usually end up being better. That's why when Grand Blue comes out in V-EB06, it'll actually have a good matchup against these force decks, just because it's going to be a good protect deck that can protect against those big columns that Bermuda throws at them and still respond with big columns like with Skull Dragons, etc. So that's why I think OTT and Angels being like 7 and 4% respectively makes sense, because they can actually produce enough defense to protect against all of these attacks. So for OTT, getting protect markers and stuff isn't much of a problem, so they can actually defend against it, and they still have their kind of push. Obviously, I think it's still a bit hard for them, just like it is for any deck, but I think out of everything, they can like keep up with it pretty well. Then same with Angel Feather, like it's always going to be a good, it's, you know, moderately slow, but obviously it's always going to be good. It makes a lot of protect markers, can easily defend itself, and like heal out of these like big rushes that Bermuda does. And you know, a lot of like Bermuda matchups, you know, they do rush quite fast, especially like in the Bermuda Mirror. I think it really does come down to who can rush faster, and then after that it's done, who can survive the longest, you know, which, I mean, makes sense, but that just kind of, I feel like the game plan for the Mirror. But, so I think Angels can usually survive that relatively well, but I mean, it is dependent. Shadows, I think, I mean, they're only at 3%, but against Bermuda, I think Shadows actually have a pretty good matchup, just because they can, like, board wipe pretty well, and also just, like, being able to retire things. Like, it's not as good as, like, being able to selectively retire, or, like, how Link Joker has, like, selective binding, because with Shadows, a lot of the stuff is, like, oh, your opponent chooses, so obviously they're not going to choose to, you know, retire their own, like, Caro, or their own Fina, or Sonata, right? They're going to try to retire something else. But if that's all they have, then they will be losing out on stuff, and so that's quite important. That is quite good for Shadows, but I think they do struggle against it. Like, they need their new support to kind of keep up, I think. And then Nubatama has been seeing more tops lately than at the release, I think. So people have been playing more and more Nubatama, and so it's kind of interesting to me. I haven't really seen like gameplay of standard Nubatama that much at like these like big events, but it has been picking up tops here and there, and like even like 3% is pretty significant, because it actually has more tops than most of the clans that got support in V-EB06, so that's something to consider. Neo Nectar falls into the same kind of pile at 2%. CanYouSayG actually posted an article on how standard Neo Nectar should be adapted to the new meta, and how it can actually keep up. So that's really cool, because it's a clan that only got one wave of support, but it can keep up with the meta, and that's, I think, really interesting, because that way, like, you can adapt the build a little bit to go away from what it used to be, but be able to respond to the current threats, like Bermuda and whatnot, and still be able to be a relatively big threat in the format. So that's really interesting. If you are a Neo Nectar player, or if you're interested, I will link the article in the description if you want to read it. I personally learned something new from it as well, so I think it's definitely worth to give it a read. Then we have Link Joker. So Link Joker did get its buff, you know, with Brand. Brand itself is okay. Like, we saw literally just now, as I'm recording this, it just ended the Trigger Twice VGCS, saw Brand in top 4, and so I think it's relatively good. You know, depends on the meta. Like, we saw that the Angel Feather matchup is actually quite good, because they do check more triggers technically than other decks, and so that's quite interesting, I think. And then, you know, they will be getting better with Messiahs, and I think a lot of these, some of the lists actually that like did top are still the leaders, because the leaders are still very good. You know, in Standard it's like kind of iffy, just because, you know, it's every turn you're usually trying to rewrite, unless you're Bermuda. Bermuda calls a lot of their grade 3s, and they're finally just writing 1s, so actually, in that sense, the leaders can do okay, but I feel like they can't really keep up with the numbers and the lines of Bermuda for now. But I think again with the release of Messiahs, that matchup will also be okay because of a lot of the selective binding that you can do with that deck. So I think it's going to be quite good in that sense. Then we have Murakumo drop down to just 1% here, so these remaining ones will be just 1%. So Murakumo, still Shirayuki, Zanbaku, you know, still doing okay. It's still a very strong deck. It's the kind of thing where it's like, it'll beat all the like tier 1.5, tier 2 decks. Even some of the tier 1 decks I think it can beat. It's just that like against Bermuda, they don't really care too much because their rearguard lines are so huge that it's like, okay, I don't get to attack with my Vanguard, but it's like you're already dead anyway. So I think that's kind of the thing. And with Murakumo, you can try to like counterplay them pretty easily and try to like damage deny them pretty easily. So I think that's part of it. So we'll see how that shapes up later on. Novas don't have enough support yet. Like V-EB06 was good, it's a good start, but they will not become the god deck that they are until the next set. Then with the next set, with Illuminal, Kick, and Grant, then Nova becomes really good. Then Nova does need to be taking a lot more tops in the meta, and I think it did, and we're going to see that it really did. So that's really important. Royals, again, it's a 1%, it's not much. I don't think it was even... I should check actually which Royal list this was, if it's provided, because I'm interested if it's Blasters or not. So this was from a Team VGCS, and it was literally just an Alfred list, so it wasn't even Blasters. So yeah, so that 1% of Royals wasn't even Blasters, so unfortunately that shows the disappointingness of V-EB06 Blasters. Even though it's a cool deck, it really isn't all that competitive. Then we have 1% Tachikaze. We also saw in English, you know, in recent Springfest, Tachikaze did get a top. And Tachikaze always kind of just like randomly comes up because people are either not prepared for it, or that the Tachikaze player like high rolls insanely well during the event, and then like if Tachikaze high rolls, it's hard to stop it. That's been the case since it came out, and I think it's going to continue being the case until the next support, which then maybe it'll become more consistent, who knows. Then finally, the last 1% is Dark Regulars. Nothing much to say here. Hasn't had much support since, you know, Viola's the leader, so I mean since the last time we talked about this. So I think it's fine, but it's not something that like I feel the need to talk about. I think this is like, this was probably on a team as well. I'm gonna check again. Oh, actually it wasn't. It was a VGCS with 62 players, and it was a VMC as well, which is pretty huge. So, oh, but this is basically your very standard DI list. So it's just running like 4 Demon Eater, 4 NLK, and then 1 of the Master Fifth Element. It does run 4 of the Gwyn the Ripper, so pretty interesting. Also 8 draws, so maybe that's a build path for Dark Irregulars right now, potentially. But I think, you know, once they get their new support, it's gonna go up as well. But we'll see. Dark Irregulars is interesting, especially in Premium, just because there's so many different builds for it now with the new Gastille Stride. So I think, like, it's only going to become more complex and more interesting over time, but again, that's kind of the case for Premium. Standard is still going to become more interesting over time, but it doesn't like reach the levels of Premium, obviously. But so that's going to be it, I think, for this meta wrap-up for the V-EB06 meta in Japan. Obviously, the results and what you can expect in English might differ a little bit, but I think it's very commonly agreed also in the English community that Bermuda is still an overwhelmingly strong deck, and that Kagero is a close second. So I think we're still going to see the same patterns. OTT is always going to be a safe pick. Angels are still a safe pick, I think. Shadow, I'm not sure how safe that is. It's still pretty safe, but it has more bad matchups. Neo Nectar, I think if you adapt the way that CanYouSayG has written, I think it's okay too. Novas, I think for now are still kind of sketchy, same with Link Joker. And so I think it's best to wait for another set for those if you're really trying to win a Springfest. So we're already on our last month of Springfest, so it's literally just going to be this set if you're still competing in Springfest. If not, then you can already start testing with the new stuff online, or, you know, with proxies, because that's going to be our meta for the BCS format if you are very competitive and if you don't have stuff like ARGs, car market series, etc. to attend to. So that's going to be it for me today. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Check out all the handy links in the description. As always, click those bell buttons as you guys do, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.